Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video I wanted to speak about ignorance and humility. In preparation for this video, I was taking the time to look through my list of ideas to decide which one I should speak about today. But as I was going through the list, I kept telling myself that I didn't know enough about the topic to speak articulately about it. And that got me thinking about the notion of ignorance as such. Everyone is ignorant. It's a perennial problem. It's an aspect of the human experience of being that everyone has faced, and it's something that everyone will continue to face forever. So the question is not necessarily how to get rid of ignorance, although it's important to battle against it. But what I thought about was, what is the proper attitude to have when facing ignorance? But perhaps we should back up. Human beings are limited. One of the ways that we're limited is that we can't assess all of the information around us all of the time. We can't store this information. We can't manipulate all of it. And so whenever we are encountering reality, we're dealing with the map and not the territory. The distance between the map and the territory could be considered our assumptions that we make about the world. We assume that the infrastructure and the state and society around us, at least in the West or in civilized cities and nations, all of that is just working as fine as it should be. Part of the evidence, of course, is that things aren't collapsing around us, but to the extent that we're able to survive and walk outside and carry on our daily lives, we make assumptions that things are as good as they should be, or things are operating as normal. When I go to work, I assume that my home is not on fire. When I park my car to go to the gym, I assume that no one is currently stealing my car. And so we make assumptions to make up for our lack of knowledge. And that's helpful because it allows us to move forward. We are able to make a decision based on those assumptions, but it can be detrimental, of course, if those assumptions are wrong. So ignorance is something that we're always contending with. And of course, we can battle against it by gaining knowledge either through direct experience or the indirect experience of others, of others, which would be reading books or listening to lectures. And at some point, as we gather this knowledge and combine it with our own experience, that turns into wisdom. But it seems that the proper way to contend with ignorance should be with a mindset of humility. To first contend with ignorance, you have to admit that there's something that you don't know. And if you can't do that, well, then you believe that you know everything, or you believe that anything novel that comes your way has a ready answer that you can supply. An answer that is also correct in your estimation. And so to be able to deal with ignorance and adapt to it and learn, you have to be humble and you have to admit that you don't know everything and that you can't know everything. I'm currently reading Awakenings by Oliver Sacks, and in the first part of the book, he's talking about how patients who had various forms of Parkinson's disease were being treated with a experimental drug called L-Dopa. And at the time, the mainstream healthcare institutions wanted this drug to be a form of miracle drug. And there were certain initial results that conveyed such that case. But as Dr. Sachs was continuing to administer this drug and track the case studies with his patients as they were on the drug, he started to notice, observe, and communicate negative side effects and uncontrolled and unpredictable side effects. And as he was communicating and writing about these observations of these negative side effects, that the mainstream healthcare institutions, his colleagues, his peers, started to label him as a anti-L-DOPA professional, or they would criticize his work, or they would completely ignore it. He talked about how he communicated these observations in two formats. One was a narrative form where he detailed the personal observations and personal anecdotes of the patients, and another was a more statistically driven, professional, traditional research paper. And both of those initially received a critical backlash from the healthcare community. Come to find out, years later, as L-DOPA was given to more and more patients, the true side effects that Dr. Sachs articulated manifested themselves in more and more clinical settings, to the point where it was an undeniable experience of physicians and healthcare clinicians who were dealing with uh, patients with Parkinson's disease. And so, for about a decade or so, the mainstream healthcare institutions denied the truth. And part of it was because they were rigid in their thinking, and they were not allowing themselves to battle truthfully with their ignorance. They thought that they knew all the answers, and with this particular instance, they felt that any information or facts to the contrary, no matter how credible, were just plain out wrong. And so it's something that we are seeing today, of course, at the individual level and at the social level, at the institutional level. Ignorance is a powerful force that, if we don't approach it with humility, and if we don't contend with it carefully, can blind us to reality and lead to unnecessary suffering. So, what exactly does it mean to contend with your own ignorance with humility? Well, we can frame this in the form of a relationship. Let's say you're married, or you have a boyfriend or girlfriend, or even if you have a close family friend. As you're interacting with each other, the fact that both of you see the world differently is going to manifest in different ways. It could be something as small as some logistical um, dynamic in the household. It could be thoughts about the future, 3 to 5 years out. Do you want to have kids? Where are you going to live? And anywhere in between. And what's important in a relationship, under the paradigm of humility, is to understand that you could be wrong and the other person could be right. Now, both of you should have that mindset. And this kind of goes to a previous video where I spoke about the teachings of Carl Rogers. When you're discussing certain matters, the goal should be the manifestation of the truth in pursuit of the ideal relationship, which could be boiled down to love, it could be boiled down to the good, it could be boiled down to God. But there's some higher order vision of what the relationship could be. And given that the ideal hasn't manifested in the present, and perhaps it never will, but you're on the journey to pursuing that ideal, given that there's a gap between your current situation and the ideal, to admit that you're pursuing the ideal in the first place is to have a form of humility, because you're acknowledging that gap. And when you're having the conversation with the other person, that fact has to manifest itself on two planes. One, internally within yourself, you have to know that you're not everything that you could be and that you could be wrong. And two, you also have to understand that in the relationship, both of you are growing not only as individuals, but as people together. And so as you're negotiating those interactions, part of the ways that you could have humility is to demonstrate grace for yourself and for the other person, and for the relationship as a whole. Going back to one of the things I said earlier, as you're moving through the relationship, you're going to have to make certain assumptions about what the other person's thinking, about what you're thinking, and about what you want, about what the other person wants, because you aren't constantly able to communicate with each other all of the time explicitly. And then even when you do communicate explicitly, we aren't transparent to ourselves. And so perhaps there are times where what we say is incongruent with what we actually mean or what we actually feel. And so another way of showing humility and battling against ignorance in a relationship setting is to carefully and from a place of love hash out those assumptions and bring them into the explicit and ask the question directly. I was thinking this, or I assumed this. Is it true? And then allow the other person the space and time to explicate their thoughts and feelings on that assumption. Part of what this does is that it decreases the probability or the attitude or feeling that one person is trying to be better than the other. When you realize that you are making an assumption and you're able to bring that assumption into the light of day and have it be questioned, you're showing your openness. You're showing that you're willing to be wrong. And you also understand that the importance is not for you to be right and for you to have those assumptions be correct all the time. What's more important is that you're moving forward in a manner that allows you to either confirm the assumptions that are true or disconfirm and then correct the assumptions that aren't true. And you want to be constantly doing that. And so you're constantly doing away, shedding assumptions that are incorrect, and then adopting new ones. And that process is something that's ongoing and it could be painful, but it's not as painful as clinging on to those incorrect assumptions, which then drive your actions and behaviors and can lead the relationship towards a bad place. One of the ways that we try to battle ignorance is by subjecting ourselves to the consensus of the whole. We look at what society does, we look at what we do as individuals, and we compare and contrast our behaviors. And as we're reflecting upon the differences in the outcomes, we ask ourselves, well, maybe this specific assumption, I should discard it or exchange it for that of society. And I just recently finished To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. And in that book, Atticus, the lawyer, one of the main protagonists, is constantly facing this battle between what his consciousness thinks to be right and what the town and the group of people, his family and friends, think to be right. And he has this quote where he says, "The one thing that doesn't abide by majority rule is a person's conscience." I believe that that's such an interesting quote to me, and it stuck out. I'm not exactly sure why, and it's something I'm still investigating. It reminds me of the notion that man and woman are created in the image of God. It reminds me of the American Constitution, where we have free rights, or we have rights and responsibilities, and they're instilled in us from birth, and it's not something that other people give to us. It's something that we're born with. And on a more practical level, it does make me think about the fine line that we are always having to tread between conforming to society, conforming to the beliefs of other people and acting in accordance with those beliefs, and then listening to our own thoughts and feelings and knowing when it's proper to call out society, because it's very true that the crowds can be incorrect, the group can be wrong, but knowing when the group is right or when the group is wrong is very difficult. And I think that's where the search for wisdom and truth comes into play. Definitely don't have the answer to how you figure that out, but I do think that it's an interesting problem, and it's something that we're definitely seeing today as well. We tend to rely on points of authority for many of our daily or usual interactions. When I go to the doctor's office, I have no idea who this person is, but I trust that their credentials, I trust that the fact that they have that job, let's say if they're in a large hospital, the reputation of the hospital hopefully is a good one. I trust all of these different social aspects can serve as filters or barriers against any sort of malpractice or anything. And so when I book my first appointment and I show up to the hospital and I'm getting my physical, and this is a complete stranger that I don't know, I just trust that what they are going to say is going to be right. And so for many of our social activities, we just rely on other people. And for a good bit of the world and for a good bit of time, that works. At the same time, we can look at plenty of countries and plenty of instances, plenty historical instances where large amounts of people were incorrect, who were just going with the flow. Either they didn't pay attention to what was happening in their country, what was happening within the elite levels of certain institutions, or they were willingly complicit in the errors. And so that's something I'm going to leave as an open question. Curious to know any of your all's thoughts. How do you know, given that everyone is ignorant, and given that we can use general consensus to as a form to mitigate against ignorance, how do you know when the assumptions or even explicit proclamations of society are correct, or how do you know when they're wrong? All right. Thanks everyone for watching the video, and I hope to see you in a future one.